In this tutorial, we'll learn how to use a script to connect buttons to a material by recreating this grid effect here. All right, so let's start off by creating a new screen image for our material. And we will rename this to person grid. And let's create a new material. Let's just do an empty material because we need to do some node work. We'll call this grid. And let's go ahead and open the graph editor with that material selected. And then on our image, I want to put that material here. And then our image is going to be the same resolution as the screen, but I just like to do stretch anyway to make sure it fills. And let's go ahead and jump into our material and get started. Okay, so let's give ourselves a little bit more space. We're going to want to keep this open for a little bit. And let's start off by pulling in our texture. So we can do a texture 2D parameter. I'm just going to do a texture 2D object parameter. And the reason for that is we get this texture 2D thing here. And if we pull it out, we can do this texture 2D sample. And then that gives us a nice easy way to put the UV chords. We don't need to do it this way. I just think it's good to see it this way. And yeah, we can learn a little bit more about the UV chords. So let's connect that up to our shader output. And you can see it's all pinkish here. And that's because if we select our material, our texture is empty. So let's go ahead and select the device camera texture. And you might still not see anything. That's because our UV chords are at 0, 0. We're just sampling a single point of the image. So let's go ahead and search for screen UV chord. If we connect this here, now we get our full image. So this is the camera feed being displayed on our screen image here. So if we want to create that grid, all we need to do is take our UV coordinates and multiply them. So let's go ahead and multiply this out. And you can see that nothing's happening because we're multiplying by 1. So let's add an integer parameter. So I'll search for int parameter. And I'm going to call this scale. And I also want to change the script name to scale. And I'll show you why in just a second. Let's connect that to our multiply. Now here on our graph parameters for the material, you can see scale. We can change that to 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And now we get this tiling. Now if I hover my mouse over scale, you can see property scale pops up. And I chose to use all lowercase for that script name. So the script name here is what that property name is, and that's what we're going to use for our script. Our script is going to call the scaled property of the material so that we can adjust this value. Okay, so let's go ahead and set up the rest of the scene really quick. So for our buttons, I'm going to use some screen images, but I don't want them to show up in the final snap. So in the scene config, we're going to have a separate live target, which is what the user sees, versus a capture target, which is actually in the snap. So here in the resources panel, I want to create a new render target, and I'll call this UI, or user interface. In the scene config, that is going to be my live target. Now over here, if we refresh, we'll still see our grid stuff here. That's just because nothing's feeding into this, so it's basically falling back onto the render target. So what I want to do is, let's just take our orthographic camera. I'm going to hit Control D, or you can right click to find duplicate here up at the top. And now here, I'm going to do some renaming. So this is the UI cam. I want to change the layers. Let's add a new layer. Let's call this UI. So I want to select UI, deselect orthographic. And also for the camera, I want the clear color option to be a texture. And that input is going to be the rendered target. So the rendered target is the rest of the scene. That will feed into our UI camera. And then we'll put the rest of the stuff on it. So we also want to change this render targets to UI. So we still don't see any big changes over here, and that's good. So this person grid here, we want to go ahead and delete it. And with this full frame region here selected, let's add a new screen image. Just get a fresh image. So here we have this new image here. And let's make sure it is on the correct layer. You can see here it is on UI. If it ended up on the orthographic layer, just switch it there. Now, if I click here on the preview panel, and I click this button here, this is the capture mode. So you see the capture mode, we have our grid, but we don't have this new screen image on our UI camera. So just a quick recap, because that was a lot. Our UI camera is outputting to a separate render target, has its own layer, and the input, which comes from this clear color option being texture, is going to be our original render target. And in our scene config, we have our UI rendering last. So all of our scene gets rendered to this render target, which feeds into the UI camera and the UI render target. And so this shows up to the user, but it's not in the final snap. And that's just because we don't need to show those buttons in the final snap. That's not what's important. The effect is what is important. Okay, so let's go ahead and finish this up. So let's select our full frame region. Let's do safe render. So if we come to the scene, you can see that we have this being cut off at the top and bottom to account for the buttons in the Snapchat UI. Let's call this minus button. And I'm going to put this over here on the left. Maybe let's stick it up here. And then I'm going to duplicate this. Call this the add button. And let's move it over here to the right. So it's over on the side. And if we want, we could pin to the edge. Just to make sure that it is staying on the edge. And we have our two buttons on top of our effect. So again, go to the capture mode. Those buttons disappear because we don't need them in the final snap, but they're visible to the user while they're creating the snap. And now for the textures, I went to pixabay.com and I found this minus button and then a plus button. So I already downloaded those. I'll go ahead and drag them into my scene. So let's just drop them here. Now I can select my screen images here. Let's add our buttons. So now we have our buttons in the scene. And let's go ahead and make them actually do something. Okay, so we do need a script to control everything, but first, with these images selected, I'm going to add a component. I want to add an interaction component, and this tracks taps or drags or any interaction with the screen, and it is going to let us track those interactions if it happens with this button. So I also want to select the minus button, and let's also add an interaction component. And with those added, let's go ahead and create our script. Let's rename this let's just call it button controller. And then let's open in the built-in editor. And let's go ahead and add it to our scene. So I'm just going to click and drag it up here. Let's call this button controller. And on awake is fine. You can see our script is added. So here in the script, let's go ahead and create some inputs for those interaction components. So I'm going to do a / at input, and I want to do a component dot interaction component. I'll do this for the minus button, and I'll do the same thing for the add button. All right, so now I'm going to hit Control S. If you see that little circle there, that means your script is not saved. So I'll save it. And if I select my script, we have those two inputs. So let's click here. Let's find our minus button, and let's find our add button. So a common mistake people make is they forget to choose the inputs for the script. So make sure you do that. And now that we have them, we can create some functions to change the number of items in this grid. So we're going to create a minimum count. So let's do a const min count. Let's say we never want to go below 1. Let's say our max count, let's spell things correctly. Max count equals 10. So we can't go above 10. And then we're going to let current count, let's say 2. So you might notice I did a const. Our min and max won't change, but our current count is going to change, so I use let to declare this variable. All right, so let's create a couple functions. So function, let's say increase count, and we'll take our current count. That's going to be our current count plus 1. Now, there are other ways you could do this. You could do current count plus equals 1. It's up to you just for readability. So we'll just go with this first method for now. All right, so we're taking our current count. We're adding 1 to it. So now we just need to say if our current count is greater than max count, current count will equal max count. And so that way we won't ever go above our max count. So now we're going to create a function to decrease the count, and it'll be very similar to our increase count. So say current count gets current count minus 1. And if our current count is less than our min count, then our current count will become our min count. So that way we never go below 1. So now that we have those, we're going to attach them to these interaction components. So we're going to do script dot minus button. So that's going to let us access this minus button interaction component. And we're going to take on tap. We're going to add our decrease count function. So the interaction component has this little on tap callback. So when it's tapped, it will call whatever functions we've added to it. So we're adding our decrease count to the minus button. Let's go script dot add button dot on tap dot add. And we'll do our increase count. And so that will now start to work. So we're going to save this. And now if I click these buttons, you might see nothing happening, but we also have no errors down here. So that's good. So what we could do is to make sure it's working, we can print out our current count here. And also here, print current count. And now if I click the buttons, you can see that we have 1, and I can add that. And we can go all the way up to 10, and then we'll stop going up above that. And so that's perfect. Now we just need to connect our material to it, and we're good to go. All right, so what we need to do is let's do a new input. And this time it's going to be an asset.material. And we'll just call this grid mat. Let's save our script. We get our new input. Let's pull our grid in. And now what we need to do is we're going to do script.gridmat. And then we have to do main pass. And then we're going to do dot scale. That's that property that we set. We'll say gets current count. And then we also want to do it here. Script.gridmat.main pass dot scale gets current count. And then also, you might notice that we set it to 4 inside of our material, but our script is starting at 2. So I'm going to, let's make sure that we type that out correctly with the capital M. So I'm going to copy this and also stick it out here so that when the script starts up, it sets our material correctly. So now save that and look at that. We are now setting it to 2 by 2. We can hit that button and we go down to 1, and we can go up all the way up to 10 by 10. And then we can't go past that, and then we can go down. So that is pretty neat. We've created the material, we've created a few buttons, and now we have our script connecting to those buttons and controlling our material. And then of course, we can go to our capture mode, and those buttons are nowhere in sight. And I know where the button is, so I can tap here, and you can see it's still working. So that is pretty neat. So it did take a little bit of scripting. I know that can be intimidating for people. But as you can see, we got a lot of power. We add this cool functionality to our lens, because we could connect our buttons to our material.